Alan, I'm so happy that we finally sat down to have this conversation. We've spoken about it for some time now, so it's really good to be here, to be sat down and have a chat. From what we're looking to do today is looking to talk about the art of the exit. So the if, the why, and the when to sell your business. What I've really enjoyed about us working together is that we've both had mutual clients who are business owners who are working towards selling their business. So it's been wonderful working with you and introducing my clients to you and vice versa. So I feel like we've got some really good experiences that we could share as well. But before we start, it'd be really helpful if you can just give some background to who is Alan Wick and what do you do?
Well, I've been a business coach and consultant since 2002. I've worked with, I think, somewhere like over 1,000 businesses in that time. And I support entrepreneurs with businesses of all shapes and sizes, all types of sectors. And before then, I was 25 years building, developing and selling my own businesses nationally and internationally. So I bring those experiences very much to bear when I'm helping clients exit their businesses.
So, Alan, let's start with the first topic, which is considering when or whether to sell your business. So part of our conversation today is going to be around a number of areas that we've spoken about, where we've got experiences of working with clients, where we work with other professional partners and give the client lots of help and lots of support to try and get the best outcome for them and to, if it's possible, to enjoy the experience of selling your business. But I'd like to flip this on its head and say, if a client were not to go through this process, if they were not to use a business coach and they went out on their own trying to sell their business, what could be the downside of not going through the process that we're going to discuss today?
It's almost always when owners try to treat it like a transaction. It's just like selling another product or service. And they don't realize that mergers and acquisitions, selling their business, that whole area is a totally different feel from what they've been used to forming, running their businesses. And so what I've seen happen is that companies that have tried that and, for example, have contacted a business broker and just gone straight to market with that. And I don't want to do business brokers down. They perform a valuable service, but then they end up getting usually a low value and getting out of, I don't want to say they get taken advantage of, and I'm doing my best not to swear, but they certainly don't get the best value that they could for their business. And then over the years ahead, they'll regret it that they didn't do this properly.
Okay, so if we have a business owner who's working in their first business, they're perhaps 2-3 years away from selling their business, and you were to talk to them now, where would you start?
I'd ask them the number that they want. What have they got in mind for the amount that they'd like for their business? What do they think it's worth? Have they got any sense of that at all? And then secondly, I'd ask, why are they thinking of selling? What are the reasons behind it? Have they thought about what they want to do outside and after they've sold the business? So that would be where I'd start.
Okay, that's a really good starting point. How about, have you had situations or scenarios when you're talking to a business owner and they want to sell their business and you think now's not the right time?
Yes.
How do those conversations go?
That's usually when the business owner or owners have fallen out of love with their business, that things are going wrong. They've hit a kind of a ceiling with sales or profits. They feel that the market's just too tough, or they've burned out and they made life difficult for themselves. And no matter what they try to do, any buyer is going to pick up on that feeling, even if they try to pretend that's not happening. And again, they'll get taken advantage of. It's the worst possible time to sell.
Okay. And in your experience, how does the business owner tend to react to that conversation when you give them that feedback?
I would say, in the main, you've nailed it, Alan. Okay, I've got it, you got it. And that's true. And therefore, I'll reconsider. I would say mainly they'll reconsider. And I'll usually advise them to take more time over getting the business onto a more substantial footing, showing that there is a really good story, what I call an equity storyboard, which I'm sure we'll come on to in more detail later. Because if we're not showing a potential buyer that the future is rosy for that business, by definition, they're going to get a low value. So it's about reassessing the business. I'd almost call it like a reboot of the business and getting it back onto a better footing. And then usually clients will go, okay, then if you show me how to do that and I'll get a better value for the business, then I'm game.
Fantastic. Okay. I'm going to nick some of your phrases during this conversation, so I apologise in advance. So the first one that I want to nick, that I've heard you talk plenty of time with clients, is the issue of partneritis.
Yeah.
So you alluded to it earlier when you spoke about perhaps partners falling out within businesses. But can you perhaps give us some insight into the work that you've done and the conversations you've had with clients where perhaps one of the partners does want to sell and the other partner doesn't? It may be they haven't got the same personal situation. It may be they just don't think it's the right time to sell the business. There could be an age gap between the partners. It'd be really good to get some insight into the work that you've done with clients.
Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind with your really good question is my own experience with my own business, where there are a number of partners involved. This was my second company sale, and there was a complete disagreement about selling the business. Several partners did want to sell the business, and one in particular didn't. And at that time, and the lesson was, we didn't have a clear enough shareholders agreement that actually regulated what would happen in the event of a buyer coming along and wanting to buy the business. What would happen in the event that some of the owners wanted to sell and others didn't. So there was almighty argument, really bad, and it meant that we fell out. And that's what I mean by partneritis. And in the end, it had to go to the lawyers, with some shareholders being represented by one lawyer and the other shareholders being represented by another lawyer. So although we did manage to sell the business eventually, and thank goodness the buyer, which was a trade sale in this case, recognised what was going on in the company and was willing to deal with it, in general it's absolutely to be avoided, because the worst possible thing for the business relationships between the partners.
Absolutely. And I think that's another great example of one of the reasons to work with a business coach, because in that situation, to actually show empathy to the partners within the business, you can actually say, I've been in this situation and this is how it ended, or talk for other examples. That's a really good example. We're talking about business owners who are proactively looking to sell their business, but that's the utopia. I'm sure that you have business owners that make contact with you that have other reasons to make contact with you, and then the conversation then moves into, have you thought about selling your business? When have you thought about selling your business? Because we're going to have some business owners watching this conversation, it'd be really helpful if you can perhaps just give some examples of why a business owner would get in touch with you if it isn't directly linked to wanting to sell the business.
Yeah, it's often for one of three reasons, or a combination of those reasons: to make more money, to save time at work and have more time at home life and so on, or to reduce stress at work. So any one of a combination of those three: more money, more time, or less stress. So from Magus's point of view, James, what work would you do with a client looking to sell their business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a bit of a myth in our industry that the perfect time to be introduced to a business owner is when Alan Wick makes the introduction and says, James, I've been working with this client, they've sold the business, the cash is in their account, can you help them? Where in reality, we love being on the journey with the client. So if we go back to a scenario where you have a business owner who is 2 or 3 years away from exiting their business, what work would we do at the outset? And it's working with the client to help them understand what their number is, which you've alluded to previously. And we feel that's the most important thing that we do with a client who is 2 or 3 years away from exiting their business. So how do we do that? We use cash flow forecasting to do that work. I've been in this industry now for over 35 years, and it still amazes me when I say this next piece is that we actively encourage that if it's a couple, that both the partners, as in the husband and the wife, we sit down and we have this conversation with them, because the conversation is around what are your financial goals for you and your family? What does your future look like post the sale? What does your future look like in retirement? And the amount of times that we have these conversations with clients and they haven't had these conversations before. So the way that we bring that to life is talking to the clients. A lot of it is mediating and getting the clients to talk to each other, to share what they would like to do and perhaps what they would not like to do. And it comes down to, so if we use the example where the business owner has owned the business for perhaps 25 to 30 years, this is the one and only business they're going to have. And then when that business is sold, they need to decide what they're looking to do. So when the business is sold, will you retire? Will you take some time out? Will you look to buy another business? Will you look to do some NED work? What sort of things would you like to do? And then we bring that to life by asking the client, so when you have stopped working, at what age do you think you would like to stop working? What does your life look like then? What sort of income do you need? So what's your monthly income that you need to cover all your bills, cover your expenses? Would you want to buy a holiday home? Would you like a holiday home in the UK? Would you like a holiday home abroad? Are you interested in property? Would you like some buy-to-let properties? Are you interested in doing property development? Depending if they've got children and what ages the children are, we start to talk about education. So are we talking about private school? Are we talking about university? Would you like to provide your children with a deposit so that you can kick them out before they get too annoying? Or even with some clients, they want to set their children up and buy that first property with them. We add all this onto their cash flows. We then talk about known expenditure, known large expenditure. So what car do you drive? How often would you like to change your car? What is on your bucket list? As you draw your last breath, what things do you really want to do? Is it that world cruise? Is it travelling? Is it linked to sport? We talk through all those options with clients. Are there things that you want to do on significant birthdays, significant wedding anniversaries? All of this we put into their cash flow forecast. Now, with every single client, the cash flow forecast takes the client to age 100, and we take them to age 100 so that really stress tests what they're looking to do. And the software that we use has all the current tax tables in there. We use certain assumptions, and in this day and age, we do talk to clients around the assumptions they want to include. So inflation, for example, we include property inflation. We include potential returns on their portfolio, their investments, and the software that we use will then tell us what is the number that they need. So they can walk away from that conversation knowing if we sell our business for this amount of money, then we will never have to worry about money again, and we will achieve all of our financial goals for us as a family, which we think is really powerful. So we get to the point with the client where they know what their number is, which is a really powerful position to be in when you're considering selling your business. So with the football analogy, I'm now going to do my Kevin De Bruyne pass over to you. What do you do next with a client when we've helped to work out what their number is?
Well, that number is absolutely crucial to the bit that I then take over, because that's the number that we want to see in their bank account net. So that's after capital gains taxes. There may be entrepreneurs relief. That's something that I would get an accountant to work out for them. If they don't have an accountant that can do those calculations for them, then I'll introduce them to somebody, or I know you will as well. One of us will introduce them to an accountant that can not only help with the capital gains and entrepreneurs relief type calculations, but also help with all the financial side of any exit and what the consequences might be. Once I've got that number from the accountant, that gives me the gross amount that the buyer will pay pre-tax to the client. And once we've got that number, in 9 cases out of 10, there's a gap between what the company is worth right now and what we need to get it to achieve that gross number. because I then do a calculation based on average values for that type of business. And it's almost always based on value equals profit times multiple. So, for example, there's a client I work with that Magus introduced me to, and I can talk about it publicly because I've been permissioned to do so, that was called Plant Expand. And Plant Expand was a 25-year-old business, a B2B engineering services company, and they were making about £800,000 EBITDA on 5 million turnover. And at that time, their accountant felt that they could get maybe between 6.5 and 7 million for the business. And that sounded like a good number, and they sounded like they felt, the husband and wife team that owned it, that could be a good number for them. But when you did Magus did its bit and put everything through the black box, as I called it, that you just described, we discovered that actually they need more like 8 to 9 million pounds. So over a period of 18 months, 2 years, we should get into more detail, I then helped them grow the value of the business so they could achieve the number that you'd worked out for them.
And that's so powerful. If we put that into some context where we hadn't have had that conversation, we hadn't worked out what the number was, and then you sold the business at that lower figure, and then they run out of money, that's a really awkward conversation to be having using the benefit of hindsight.
Exactly. So the combination of them working out what the number is and then I like to work past it, because we can't always guarantee what the multiple or the valuation that a buyer's going to put on it. I can have a rough idea. We can get ideas from the sector, the trade area that they will operate in, and we can look also at other examples of sales in their sector to get a rough idea of what valuations are. But then you're never guaranteed with private companies. We called today the art of the exit. Valuing private companies is as much an art as a science. And sometimes we get a lot more than expected, but I like to work conservatively with clients and then get to a turnover and EBITDA figure where we're almost, as far as we can be, guaranteed to get at least the number that Magus has helped them work out.
So we'll move on now to preparing your business for sale. So there's lots of areas, lots of things to consider and discuss. I'm going to use another one of your words now, which is legacy. So you have a business owner, they're looking to sell the business. How caught up, how interested should they be in the legacy that they want to leave behind for their business? And what I mean by that is, how concerned should they be for who's going to buy the business and what they're going to do to the business? Because is this something that a business owner can and should control? Or is it something that's out of their control and they shouldn't worry about it?
The place to start is who. In other words, let me use a house analogy. If we're selling our house, the estate agent will give an idea of who the target market is for this particular home. Is it for a family? Is it for a single? Is it a couple? It's the same with selling a business. We work out who is the ideal buyer for the business. With some clients, they've been running the business for so long and they're so much looking forward to retirement that they will go with the highest offer and they'll make it secondary who's going to buy the business. With other clients, for example, Outboard Electronics that I helped sell last year, they've cared enormously. They're a high-tech spatial audio company, and they particularly wanted to sell their business to a trade buyer who they knew would take their 25 years' work building the business up and then continue to develop the business. And in those cases, we will look for a trade buyer and ignore any private equity houses. It's sometimes the case where companies who want just the maximum value and care less about who will go with private equity buyers or high net worth individuals that really are looking to make more money, and they're looking for return more than caring about the legacy. So there's no right or wrong. It varies enormously between business owners.
So it sounds like the business owner that just wants to get the best price is a lot easier to work with. So in what circumstances would you try and dissuade a business owner if you thought they were going down the wrong track by being perhaps too narrow, too specific, and too concerned about what's going to happen in the future with their business, rather than look for the highest return?
Yeah, I give them examples over my career of having done countless numbers of deals with my own businesses and with clients of what things have gone well and what things haven't gone so well post-sale. We will talk in more detail about it, but the concept of an earn-out, where there's a certain amount of cash put down at completion and then a certain amount of money depending on performance, and that usually where they go wrong is where there's a mismatch between the company that's buying and the company that's selling in terms of expectations over the years ahead. And so we'd go through those options, and then I'd make sure that the client is making choices that are informed. That's the key thing,
okay,
that they understand what they're getting into and what the pros and cons are with each option.
So we will have business owners listening to this recording now who are interested in selling their business. They want to make that next move. Where do you start in the process of preparing your business for a sale?
It's again, starting with who, because different buyers are going to value different things in a business. So if I go back to the house analogy, let's say there's a growing family moving into the area because they want to be near a particular school. And let's say that it's a 3 or 4 bedroom family house, but there's a spare room that is not in very good shape. But we also know that the attic has got development potential. So what we might do in those circumstances, okay, our target market, a growing family, is really going to value the possibility of being able to grow into the house, use the attic, develop it, and so on. So that's worth investing in an attic, a loft conversion for that target market. But if it's a different target market for a house, let's say it's an individual who wants to buy something that's going to be very sporty, or wants to find something for exercise, or is looking for something that is more lifestyle, then we might look at an extension to the house. We might look at even a swimming pool or a tennis court, depending on the levels we're talking about here. Exactly the same with selling a business. We look at the target market, whether that's private equity, a trade buyer, or high net worth individuals or combinations. We then put ourselves into the minds of those buyers and then have a look at what they would value. And then we work backwards from that to what do we want to do to the business and for the business, just like I talked about the house, in order to get it ready for sale and getting the maximum value.
Okay, that's a really good analogy. Thanks for sharing that, Alan. I know when we've had meetings with clients in the past who are looking to sell their business, you talk about keeping an open mind during the process. So can you talk a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a lot to do with how they treat their own people. For example, let me take an extreme where it's been very much a baby boomer generation command and control sort of business, where very little information is shared with the team, and everything is kept very tight. Well, what about the situation where they're going to sell the business and anybody finds out? Do they want to keep it a secret? They want to just their team not to know anything about it. They need to be open-minded to the idea that they may get a better value for their business if they give some indication of what they're intending. Under those circumstances, I tend to recommend that they tell people and their team that the strangers coming and going from there into the business and looking around, and often besuited and looking a little bit official and formal, that they're thinking of investing in the business because we're going for growth. So that takes open-minded. And the same the other way round. If we take a business where they've been completely open with their employees, all the financial information is shared, there may be circumstances where they actually need to be a bit more cautious about what they share with their team for various reasons. So again, I would challenge their thinking and then ask them to be a little bit more open-minded about how they treat the whole concept of selling their business.
I think that's a really good example to use in why we're having this conversation about working with a business coach, so you can have that conversation and just give them a balanced view on why you would tell your employees and why you would not tell your employees, or whether there's a few that you tell for now and to get the right mix.
So, James, from a Magus point of view, what work do you do to get clients prepared for the business sale?
Yeah, really good question, Alan. I think linked to the conversation of how you like to work with clients, ideally, we'd like to be working with a client, again, 2 to 3 years before they're looking to exit their business. One of the things that we like to get involved with to facilitate is around helping that business owner get their professional team around them as early as possible. We find with experience that if you work with a professional team where they know each other, where they've worked together over the years, it makes for a much better experience and a much better outcome for the client. So what I mean by that is a client will typically need a personal lawyer, a corporate lawyer, someone to look at tax from a corporate point of view and tax from a personal point of view as well. And then we sit beside those professional partners on the wealth planning side of things. Now, if a client has an existing lawyer, an existing tax advisor, very, very happy to work with them. If they don't, then we're very happy to make introductions and introduce those professional partners. We've worked together on many clients where we've worked with lawyers, tax advisors who we know, who we've worked together, and it just seems a much more seamless approach. But the sorts of things that we discuss, and apologies now, I'm going to get a little bit morbid on the conversations that we have with our client, because we all hope that the business transaction is successful and the clients get to the end of that transaction, but we also need to be mindful of that may not be the case with the client. So if I give you a scenario where, let's say there are 2 owners of a business, they each own the business 50-50, and one of the owners is our client. If that client, for example, is married, we would have a conversation with our client and their partner and say, what would happen if you, as in the 50% owner of the business, if you died before the business was sold? Now, when we ask that question, it tends to be the first time they've been asked that question. And they generally don't know the answer. So we say, well, the current situation is, if you were to die before the business is sold, your partner would inherit the shares in the business. We then face their partner and say, would you like to get involved in the business? Would you like to run the business? If they say, that would be fantastic, I've always wanted to do that, then that's great. 9 times out of 10, 10 times out of 10, that isn't the conversation. It tends to be, I wouldn't know how to run the business. I wouldn't want to run the business. What are the other options? So that's when we have conversations around shareholder agreements, shareholder protection. So in that scenario, that client's preference would be that if they were to die, that a life insurance policy would pay out to their partner receives the cash, and the other business partner receives the shares in the company. So we have that conversation. We then get a little bit lower on the morbid conversation, which is around, if you haven't died but you've lost mental capacity, who runs the business for you? What have you got in place? And again, vast majority of times, nothing's in place. So that's where we work with lawyers who can help and support lasting power of attorneys, get things set up in the business for the eventuality if something does happen to you, you lose capacity or you die before you sell the business. We then look at the client's personal situation. Have you made a will? Is your will current? Does it reflect all of your wishes? If it doesn't, then let's get your wills reviewed and get them updated. We then talk about lasting powers of attorney. Have you got those in place? If you haven't, then let's get that in place for you. So that's the starting point, is looking at that morbid side of things, of what happens if you're incapacitated or you die before the business is sold. We then move on to, what do your financial affairs look like now ahead of selling your business? So again, if I give an example where we've done the cash flow forecasting, you're working with us and the client needs, let's say, £3 million in assets in their business, never have to worry about money again, never have to work again, but you're confident you can sell the business for 6 million, 7 million, 8 million. It's really important to have that conversation with the client now before they've sold the business. And that tends to be a conversation on the legal side, but also really important on the tax planning side. We've seen with a change of government recently and what's happening to taxes at the moment, they're going one way and they may continue to go one way. So clients are really interested in knowing what they can do to reduce tax. If you haven't worked out what their number is, it's really difficult to have an open conversation around tax planning. So I'm not a tax advisor, I don't give tax advice, but to give you some examples of how we work with clients recently is where, if we use the example of the business is worth 3 million, but you're confident the business could be sold for 6 million, that's when we start to have conversations about setting up a trust, for example, where you can set up a family trust before the business is sold. If you know the business sale is going ahead, then you do have the option of transferring some of your shares into trust for your family, and then you've done the tax planning work before the business has been sold. Rather than the business is sold, you've now got all this wealth, you potentially got double the wealth that you actually need, and to do some tax planning work from there, you can still do it, but it's not as easy and as straightforward than if you possibly looked at that before you sold the business. So they're the sorts of things, the sorts of conversations that we would have with clients in getting ready and prepared on the financial side. So Alan, we've spoken about considering when or whether to sell your business. We then moved on to preparing your business for sale. Really like to spend some quality time now on maximising value. For me, this is such a huge part of your role as a business coach and working with clients. It's really where we see lots of value that you give to clients. I've experienced that many times with clients of mine. So could you talk me through in a bit more detail what you mean by maximising value? And if you've got an example or two to share, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, going back to the house analogy that we talked about earlier, with a house, you'd have a look for and get rid of dry rot, wet rot, paint peeling, things that can bring the value of the house down to a buyer. Obviously, a buyer of a house is going to have a surveyor. They're going to have a mortgage valuation probably. They're going to have somebody maybe do a thorough survey of the house. And the idea is that surveyor, to earn their money, usually wants to find fault in the house. So with that information, the buyer can then say to the seller of the house, well, there are these problems with the house, you've asked this amount for the house, but I'm sorry, I'm going to offer you that amount because we found those things. So the first thing to do is the business equivalent of that, and do a thorough, what I call a reality check of the house, of the business. So in other words, one client called it like an MRI scan of my business, and I conduct that. I look at all the financials. I speak to a whole team of people, or depending on the size of the business, or a cross section of the team in the business. I look at every aspect of it, and the eyes I'm looking at it through is the eyes of a buyer for that business, or in some cases an investor. But for today, for the art of an exit, I'm looking very much through the eyes of a buyer. So some examples of things that can bring the value of a business down. Almost always, because it's so common, is that the business is reliant on the owner or owners to run the business because they're still so involved. So one of the first things I do is get a succession plan in place so that ideally by the time the business is put up for sale, and it can take 18 months or a couple of years, the majority, if not all of that succession plan has taken place. So a buyer can see that the business is now no longer reliant on the founder or founders for the business to succeed and go further in the future. And then another great example are if there are hidden liabilities. Maybe there are things that the business has had on the balance sheet, like possibly legal action or things going wrong. Or another example might be over-reliance on just a few clients, customers. I have one business that was and still is a manufacturer of gluten-free food. And then when they went for investment and then eventually exit, it turned out that 80% of their sales were with 3 of the major retailers, Tesco and Sainsbury's and so on, and Waitrose. And what that meant was that a buyer would say, but hold on a minute, you only need to lose one of those and the business is going to be affected very badly. So there's a whole range of things that the business equivalent of wet rot, dry rot, paint peeling, that I then want them to correct. So that when what's called due diligence comes in, where the equivalent of surveyors get involved, which are accountants and lawyers who are acting on behalf of the buyer, and just like the surveyor, they want to earn their fees by showing the buyer these are all the reasons to decrease your offer. So we want to minimize that or get rid of it altogether. And then the second part of the work is then the more exciting, more interesting part of it, having corrected all the things that are to do with bringing the value down, things that increase the value of the business, having strong processes, procedures, showing a buyer that there's a really good culture in the business and that people are dedicated to the business and going to carry on with it, demonstrating perhaps that there are different channels to market, that not only have we got direct sales from the web, we also have dealers and other retailers and maybe an export market. So there are many ways that the business is actually taking money in. Maybe it's the branding and getting the brand really strong. And often I find that companies haven't really put much work into what I call positioning of their brand. So we'll put a positioning strategy in place so that we're demonstrating to a buyer this is a really strong brand. And then ultimately, the thing that increases value most, which is rare, is scalability. And that's why the Instagrams, Facebooks, etc. get such huge valuations, and they usually apply to SaaS businesses, software as a service, where they're hugely scalable, and that will increase the value the most. So the main work for increasing valuation is getting rid of all the negatives, or at least minimizing them, and then maximizing the positives by the time we're ready for sale.
I love that house analogy. That really puts it in the forefront of your mind when you think about if you've got a house and you're selling a house. So is there an example, is there a client that springs to mind of how you've really added value to their business?
Yeah, I think that the one that I can talk about openly, because it was a sale of an SME to a public company. And that's the sale, and I referred to it a little bit earlier, of a company called Outboard Electronics. And they're a tiny company, 2 owners, 25 years old, with no employees. None.
Wow.
Yeah. Everything subcontracted, freelancers only. The reason is they hated employing people. They don't want, and if they were here in the room now, I'd be pulling their leg about it, because they just didn't want the bother. So everything was freelance. So the company is a leader in the area of moving sound around venues. So, for example, for things like theatre, where there's a helicopter sound and it moves all around the theatre, that's their electronics, for example. The ABBA show, that's their electronics, things like that. And they're the real leaders. But it's a tiny company, about 400k profit on about £1.5 million of sales, and growing steadily. And so the idea was that they wanted to retire, so it was a retirement sale, and they didn't want to start another business in the future. And working out their numbers, as we did, meant that they really wanted a minimum of 2.5 mil in order to be happy. They didn't have particularly expensive needs. So when we looked at the business, as it stood at the time I went in, I tended to think we could get maybe 1.5 to 2 million for it, and that would still be quite a high multiple of the 400k they were making at that sort of company level. So we took 18 months doing all the things I've just talked about, of decreasing all the negatives, demonstrating that actually the company didn't need to rely on the two owners, and maximising the positives as I've just described. And the sale, that we identified a target, a short list of a trade sale. And to your point earlier, they absolutely didn't want to sell to private equity. They wanted their baby to be really well looked after. So they really didn't want to sell to private equity. They were very keen that their baby would be looked after with a legacy, and then therefore they would go for a trade sale. So we made a short list of 6 potential buyers, with one leading buyer for that. And then the question was, how do they actually make the trade aware that they were interested in selling the business, but without disrupting their market and rattling their distributors all around the world that they were in the process or interested in selling. So we did it in a very quiet way, and we had quiet discussions, which I helped them with on a confidential basis. And then what came out of that was a single lead buyer. And that's the company that we identified, that we eventually went with, and they were both sides were very happy to do business with each other.
So, Alan, any other examples you can share of how you've found increased value in a business that perhaps the clients didn't realise or see?
Yes, with the Bibbies, who own Plant Expand, they over a number of years had developed software that they used internally for their work. And their clients are big utilities companies and so on. And the software was a core part of what added value to the work they did for their clients. And it was something that was literally over in a corner on a PC with a very, very smart guy who had developed the software and then operated it for them every day. And I remember going around the office and saying, "Oh, what's that?" They said, "Oh, yeah, this is just the software we use, and it's something we do." I said, "Well, tell me more." They said, "Oh, yeah, it's taken us 10 years to gradually improve it and develop it, and now we couldn't manage without it." So I asked them to show it to me in more detail. And I said, "This is really, really incredible what this does. I wonder if you've ever thought of having it valued, or have you ever thought of licensing it?" "No, never. It's just part of the operation." So I said, "Well, I wonder if it's worth doing. Would you consider," and this comes back to your question earlier, James, about people being open-minded, would you be willing to have this software professionally valued and see whether it's IP, intellectual property, it's an intangible in IP, but whether it's something that would increase the value of the company when we go to negotiate with potential buyers?" So the Bibbies, to their credit, said, "Okay," and we made a little bet amongst ourselves about how much we thought it could be worth. I think there were between 3 or 4 people, but 50,000, 100,000, or maybe stretching it, 250,000, but that would be really stretching it. So I got a company in that I've worked with on and off for years, and all they do in life is value intangible assets. They're called valuation consulting, and that's all they do. Got them in, they spent days looking at it, and they produced a 16-page report, incredibly detailed, with all their reasoning, and they valued it at 1.2 million.
Wow.
So my next question was, would you consider spinning this off as into a separate company, and then you could carry on after the sale of the main business with developing this as a new business? Well, depending on age and stage of life and so on, some clients might say, yes, that's a brilliant idea. But in this case, they said, we'd rather keep it with the main business and then sell it all as one. And then that's what we did. And when we went to negotiate with the buyer, we were able to stand there on a much better footing and then increase the value of the offer they got from the private equity house they ended up selling to.
And what was their reaction when you told them what the value of that business would be?
Shocked. Absolutely shocked. I'm very pleased.
I can imagine. And the most important question of all, who won the bet? Who was closest on the bid?
I guessed $250,000. I think they'd bet 50 and 100, but I thought there's gold in them hills. This looks amazing. And I could imagine when I asked them, could this software be licensed to all the major utility companies to run their own fleets and engineering services internally? And what about competitors who might want to license the software? They all said, oh yes, they'd love to have it. We just never wanted them to. So I thought, wow, there's multi-million-pound business here.
Fantastic. Adding great value. Yeah. Great. I'd like to move on to earn-outs now. Is it possible to sell a business, receive all the cash up front, and not have an earn-out period?
Absolutely it is. And that's what I'd recommend as the ideal thing to do. And even if there's a possibility of earning more than that initial amount, the cash on completion, earn-outs are fraught with risk. I've seen them go well and many go badly. So my advice is usually to go for cash on completion.
Okay. And the reason I ask that question is that we've worked on clients together. I've had many conversations with clients where they've entered into an earn-out period. They've sold the business, and then as soon as the business is sold, they haven't enjoyed being back in their business as an employee, and they've walked away from the business. They've walked away from the earn-out they were due to earn from the business. So what tips have you got on how you navigate that? If the deal is agreed and there are earn-outs, how can that business owner ensure that they stay calm, stay in the business, and they don't walk away?
Yeah, great question. That's all about managing expectations during the sale and purchase process. And what's absolutely crucial is to get all the possible negatives out of the way, because there's an excitement of doing a deal. There's an excitement of mergers and acquisitions, doing deals, buying, selling, millions of pounds and so on involved. So both the buying company, including private equity houses, there's usually a champion at a PE house who falls in love with the business and then may persuade compliance and the other parts of the PE house, but particularly in trade sales, where they see a merger and buying and it's good, it looks good in the market and everybody's doing well, to get carried away with the positives. And my job is to say, slow down, what's going to happen exactly? And I come up with a list of areas they need to agree. And key is the roles post-acquisition. Who's doing what, by when, and being really clear about what management charges, because buying companies often bring capabilities and resources into the business they've just bought, and then they charge them a management fee. And if they're not careful, what that does is bring down the expected profits of the companies selling for the next year or two, even though they're good ideas, nobody's trying to screw anybody, it's all for the right reasons. If that isn't taken into account prior to the sale and those amounts discussed, that can lead to a fallout where the earn-outs aren't earned. The buying company thinks, oh, we've really done a good job here, we're not paying. The selling company and the owners leave with a very bad taste, and we want to avoid that at all costs.
Absolutely. And the work that you do with clients that we've worked on before jointly, where you've spent so much time managing that owner out of the business, so that when the business is sold or being sold and the company buying says, where's the owner? He comes in a couple of times a week, he's normally playing golf, he comes in for the Christmas do, etc. That's a really powerful reason to take that back seat and give up a lot of the work that you have been doing.
So from your point of view, James, what experiences have you had of clients doing well with earn-outs?
I think probably the best example that I've seen, this is about 15 years ago now, and there were, I think, 7 or 8 shareholders in the business, and they had a 7-year earnout period. They hit every single year's earnout, and at the end of that 7-year earnout period, they walked away with 100% of the deal. Not only that, but they were so confident that they were going to hit their numbers, they paid their tax up front because they were concerned of potential increases in CGT over a 7-year period. So that's probably the best example of a business where it's gone really well. Okay, Alan, so we're now going to move on to staying on track during the sale. And I know we've both experienced this with clients. It really is an emotional roller coaster at times, selling your business. It can be easy to not to stay on track. So I'm going to nick another one of your phrases here, which is selling your baby. So it'd be really good if you could give a bit more insight to what you mean by selling your baby and what sorts of things a business owner should be mindful of and wary of so they do stay on track.
Well, I use the term baby because of the emotional connection that entrepreneurs have with their own businesses. They've created them one way or another. They're like having another child in a way, and they love their businesses. They become attached to them. They've probably gone into business because they love what they do and they want to do something of their own rather than work for other people. They love their independence, autonomy, etc. And so although they might be attracted to the money from selling a business, there's also the emotional connection and the emotional roller coaster of dealing with people, outsiders, who are coming in, looking at their business from a totally different point of view. And what tends to happen is they underestimated the time and energy it takes to manage the process of selling their business. And then they have to balance selling their business with actually running it and keeping going. It's rare that I've come across businesses where it's no longer dependent on the owners completely by the time they sell it. There's usually at least some responsibilities to manage it. So keeping on track is about keeping their eye on the goal and keep reminding them of the benefits that will accrue from selling the business and finding the right people. Often entrepreneurs are very worried about their team. Are they going to be kept on? Is the buyer going to fire everybody? Are they going to carry on being employed? So they treat their team like their family and they worry about them. So there are all these emotional concerns coming up. And my job is to keep them on track and keep them focused on the outcome. And as each concern comes up, and it happens over months and months and months, then deal with them one by one so that we get the best outcome for that particular company.
Okay. And in your experience, how big a problem is it with clients being taken off track?
It happens very often because of things happening that are unexpected. With every business owner knows there are unexpected events, a good customer or client that suddenly stops buying their goods or services, somebody important leaving the business, a competitor coming into the market and undercutting them. All those things can happen, which are genuine business challenges, which are the owners probably got used to dealing with for 10, 15, 20 years. And therefore, the difference now is, well, that will take them off track from the process of selling their business and all the steps we've discussed about minimizing disadvantages and maximizing the advantages of buying that business. So that's the thing where we've got to keep a very careful balance.
And we are talking about the art of the exit, and there really is an art into the work that you do as the business coach in seeing those signs before the business owner does. And you can use the benefit of hindsight to say, look, you're about to go off track. We need to have a conversation about this before they make a decision that they may regret.
And that's quite right, because many clients say to me, I don't know what I don't know. that they've never been involved in mergers or acquisitions in their life, in their business career. And I've done it so many times that I can say, and now we're going to have to deal with this, or what's coming up next is that. We need to be prepared for those things. And that's what I then bring, so that we're dealing with those things before they happen. We're proactive rather than reactive.
What I wanted to talk about now is, and again, I'll give you a client scenario where we have a client where we know they need to sell their business for £3 million. You're working with a client and you believe they can get that figure to £6 million, and they turn down that offer. I've seen and I've heard this. Haven't had a great deal of contact with clients when they've made that decision, but from an outsider looking in, that does leave me scratching my head at times. So in your experience, in what scenarios would a client say no to a deal that was more money than they know that they needed?
From a buyer they don't want to sell their business to.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And if I had to generalise, it would be a PE house coming along where the owners believe that PE house is going to just want to sweat it and asset strip it and go for maximum profits, and get a quick turnaround, maybe 3 years, and then sell it on again. When they pick that up, they'd rather not sell.
Okay, that's a really, really good point you make there. So I now want to talk about negotiating. If you are selling your business and you're selling your business to a like-minded business, that's one thing. But when you do deal with private equity firms, I'm sure that the negotiating style is completely different. So how do you work with clients on helping them negotiate the sale of their business?
We work towards a legally non-binding heads of agreement, and I try to avoid the lawyers and accountants for as long as possible, and try to get English spoken and commerce spoken between the buyer and the seller over months of discussion and fleshing everything out before we get to lawyers and accountants. And whether it's a PE house or a trade sale, fundamentally there are going to be issues to talk about, and the point is not to avoid the difficult ones. So my job is to bring out, have you thought of this? Or what about that? Like you were saying earlier, with what does Magus do in the early days of, have you thought about lasting powers of attorney? What happens if one owner dies before the other one, or before the deal is done? I do the same from a commercial point of view, and try to get both the buyer and the seller openly talking about what are the worries, concerns, fears that could happen. Let's get them all out on the table. In the case of the gluten-free food manufacturer I talked about earlier, I said to them, well, a buyer will look at what is the biggest risk that could happen to this company. What could happen? I mentioned before that they had 80% of their business was just a few big retailers. Mm-hmm. Well, that wasn't the biggest risk. The biggest risk for that company was that somebody would find a cure for celiac disease.
Okay. I didn't think of it from that angle. That's a really good point.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Think about it. Because most, if not all of their sales were to celiacs. So what did we do? We identified that as a risk, and then we said, what are we going to do to ameliorate that? And then the plan was, we will develop our own brand, and then from that brand, we will be able to sell to lifestylers who like eating gluten-free food because they feel better, not because they're celiacs. And over a couple of years, we managed to get their sales of what we call lifestyler sales up to 50% of their overall sales. So that meant to an investor, or eventually as we did to a buyer, we could say, yeah, there is a risk that celiac disease might be cured, but this is what we've done to ameliorate it, therefore that we think the risk is minimized as much as possible. So we try to get all that out on the table beforehand.
It must be so comforting for that business owner to have someone like you by their side, where they can just talk openly and out loud about any concerns. One of the other concerns I wanted to talk about, and I haven't experienced this myself with talking to clients, but just reading up and reading autobiographies of people that sold their businesses, is around self-doubt, and where they're on this journey of selling the business and they get to the point of thinking, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to sell the business, or do I just keep it? So again, be really good if you could share experiences. How would you deal with that client that has got self-doubt as they're getting towards the end, when the deal is about to be agreed or even go through?
Yeah, well, that's a really good one, because we're talking really about imposter syndrome. And I would say that every single entrepreneur I've ever met, and I'll include myself in this, suffers from imposter syndrome, no matter how successful they are. There's a client I've got that built up a really successful business in the mobile phone sector, and they sold out for millions of pounds and did really well. And then they started another business in a totally different sector and took me on as their business coach. And we started working together. And even though this client had done brilliantly in business and had all the trappings of business success, as he was building the business and was attracting millions of pounds of investment, our coaching conversations on a monthly basis, let alone when it came to attracting investment and then eventual sale, was, Alan, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm up to this. Really, I'm not sure about this, and I'm not sure what people think about me. So I think that's a common aspect of successful people, and it includes actors, actresses, artists, musicians, etc., who are top of their field, and yet they still think and worry, I'm not good enough and I don't deserve this. So yes, those doubts can come up during the sale process, but then I bring reality to them and say, look what's been offered here. Look at the amount you could get. Well, they're not doing that just for the charity of it and to make you feel good. They're seeing real value here. And that way I can help them get over that worry and doubt and imposter syndrome.
Fascinating stuff, Alan. I think we've been on a real journey so far. We've spoken about considering selling your business all the way through the process of how do you start to sell the business, how do you maximise the value, how do you stay on track. I think now's a really nice time to look on the other side of the fence now, and what does life look like after the sale.
So from Magus's point of view, James, what type of conversations do you have with clients after the sale?
Now, what I'm going to say I think is quite simple and quite straightforward, but bearing in mind the reaction I get from clients, it doesn't seem to be the norm. So I'll give you an example. So last year, one of my old clients got in contact with me, who I hadn't looked after for 6 years or so, and he gave me the wonderful news that he'd sold his business. And he said, James, wanted to reach out to you to get your thoughts and views. What should I do now? The money's going to be in my bank account in a few weeks' time. So I said to him, who have you spoken to so far, and what have they told you? And he is with 2 banks. He's with one bank that looks after him from a personal point of view, and he's got his corporate bank as well. And they had both said to him, markets are doing really well, it's a really good time to be investing in the market, so they think that I should start investing now. I said, okay, do you agree with that? Well, I'm coming from a different angle. He said, okay, so what's your angle? So there's a few things I think you need to do. Number 1 is breathe. You've just sold your business. You've had this business for 25, 30 years. It's had some ups, it's had some downs. You've done some restructuring. You've been through that emotional roller coaster of selling your business. Just breathe, relax. More importantly than anything, go out and celebrate. Celebrate with your family. Book some nice meals. Book a holiday. Buy yourself some treats. Buy that car you've always wanted. Treat the kids. Treat the grandkids. Just go out and have some fun. The money, stick it on deposit. Stick it on deposit for 2-3 months. Forget about it. Breathe, relax, celebrate, because you will go through a grieving period. Yeah, you've got that euphoria now of selling the business. When you see that money hit your bank account, it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. You need to enjoy that. But over the coming months, you're going to go through that grieving process. To coin your phrase, you've just sold your baby. You're going to go through different emotions. So we'll sit down in a couple of months' time and we'll decide what the right thing to do is.
James, when we've worked on clients together, I remember when it comes close to the exit or they're in that process and we're near completion, you've talked very much about getting the family ready for the wealth that is coming. Could you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. That's a really big thing for us at Magus is future generations of wealth. I know that we've both spoken to clients in the past and asked that question, how many generations of your family would you like your wealth to pass through? So there's no right or wrong way to do this, but in scenarios, for example, where we've spoken around a business is sold for a lot more than they need it to be sold for, and that there's a trust set up for the children, or there may even be shares that are transferred directly to their children, they may be receiving their wealth earlier than they expect. And it's really important that we go through the same process with our clients' children as their parents went through. Now, all children are different when we have these conversations. When I say children, they tend to be, they're working, they're settled down, they've got families themselves. And we offer the client the opportunity, this is the children, whether they are happy with the financial planner at Magus that is looking after mum and dad, or whether we introduce a second financial planner. So it may be that we use a financial planner who is perhaps closer in age to their children. Some children may feel a bit awkward talking about their investments and what they want to do with their investments, what their financial goals are, knowing that their financial planner is the same one as mum and dad. So there's no right or wrong answer. So we have that conversation with clients and we treat them exactly the same. So we have their annual reviews of them the same way. We do the cash flow forecasting with them as well. But a really nice example that I witnessed with a client a few years ago, and this client sold their business, they were in their 70s, so they had grandchildren, and they wanted to have a closer relationship with their grandchildren, and they wanted to get their grandchildren ready for the money. So I think from memory there were 4 or 5 grandchildren, and they were an age where they were all teenagers, mid to late teens, and Granddad said to them, I'm going to give you £1,000, and that £1,000 you need to donate to a charity of your choice, but you need to go away and you need to draw up a business plan, and that business plan needs to include which charity would you give your £1,000 to, why have you chosen that charity, what do you expect the charity to spend that money on, and what will you do to work within that charity to see how they spend the money. And I worked with that client for a good 2 or 3 years after he started that process, and he said he had the most wonderful journey with his grandchildren. Sitting down with your grandchildren when they're talking you through their business plan, how they're going to invest their money with the charity of their choice, he felt a lot more comfortable and happy that when he was no longer here and his grandchildren inherited his wealth, they were better prepared to deal with the burden of receiving money.
Fascinating, and I think I'm right in saying that there's evidence that shows that wealth doesn't pass down to 3 generations. It can often pass down to the next generation, but then gets lost by the 3rd generation. So obviously that work you're doing, the way you're describing it, minimises the risk of that happening.
Absolutely. I mean, the stats, I think, are harrowing at how quickly wealth disappears within families. And in my experience, it's just down to communication and education. So from your point of view, Alan, obviously you're working with business owners who have sold their business, and whether they've had some time out from work for a period of time, hopefully the things that I've just spoken about, which is breathe, relax, go and celebrate, enjoy yourself. What examples have you got where a business owner has got it absolutely right in what they do next, and perhaps where clients perhaps have made decisions too early that they may have regretted? So what do they tend to do post exiting their business?
I think there is broadly one of 2 directions. Retirement sale, which we've spoken a lot about today. in terms of they know that they really don't want to work anymore. They might dabble a bit, maybe do a bit of mentoring or non-exec work, as you said earlier. But broadly, they're retiring, and those people are lucky enough to have interests outside business, which is not always the case, whether it's golf or flying or boating, whatever it happens to, or travel. They'll have something they're really passionate about, keen to do, and they can't wait to do that after they've sold the business. I'd say broadly that's one direction. The other direction is more of what I'd call a serial entrepreneur, like the person I referenced just earlier, who'd sold his business that was involved in the mobile phone industry, and then that, still young, had millions in the bank, thought, I've got at least another one or two games in me left, and went off and then started something completely different. And he's the type of personality that will never retire. For him, retirement is a dirty word. And so I'd say there are broadly those two types. And therefore, what's key is working out at the beginning and getting it really clear at the beginning of an engagement when I'm working with the client on which of those two you're more likely to do. And again, then from that, preparing the future from what we do today. Because the decisions that are made in selling the business, who they sell it to, how they sell it, the amount they receive, how do they judge how much they want, if it's lower or higher than what they'd imagined, that'll be directed by what do they want to do afterwards. So we get that clear right up front.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, Alan, so shall we leave it there? Yeah,
I think we have. It's been a real treat discussing all this with you. We're both very passionate about this, and I think, it's work that we're both very proud of, to help people with their businesses, selling their baby, but then becoming proud of what they've done, and then hopefully having a very good retirement or going on to create other businesses. So thank you very much indeed. And if people want to get in touch with you or with Magus, what would they do?
Best way to get in touch with me is just email me directly at jwest@maguswealth.co.uk.
Thank you.